Steve, so maybe I'll I'll explain to you a bit what this movie is about. When my grandfather was alive,
Don't have it.
before.
Where am I going to go to? Okay, just
Go to Internet Connect, the wireless connect.
I did that just a sec. And then when it comes up,
And you should say, as one of the choices, enter a T.
into TA.
Hit on that and say connect.
I did. It says you might not be able to access the internet. This problem occurred because the network is not assigned the network device to the computer.
Find a way to.
Can you put this mic somewhere, preferably? Yeah, that's fine.
How's that work?
It doesn't let me
Say
speak.
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3? Okay.
What should I do? What kind of computer do you have upstairs?
Similar PC.
Wait, take it on a little card. Do you have internet you can go?
Yeah. Do you want to just go in my room and use my computer's up and running now? No, I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you now. Why don't you go in my room and do it?
What kind of email thing do you have there?
Microsoft Outlook.
Oh, I can connect to my own website. You can send it. I put it on the
Well, no, all you do is put it in the
While you
card.
interview with him, I'll go
That's what I'm
upstairs.
saying. Yeah.
So now let me ask you this. Afterwards, if I was to go, I need to...
Who ordered the cappuccino?
I did decaf.
Alright, so we don't have cappuccino, but we don't have the cream. But if you want, we can make a fuh.
A focus with the steamed milk.
Yeah, that's okay. Steam milk from here. Here you go.
Okay, so just a second. No, I might use my question too because my alternative is to just take a cab to go home.
You decide.
Come back. But here's my question that's related to that. Would you be okay with two of us taking a cab? Say hi to my dad. I'll change and we'll go.
Yeah, it'd be great. It'd be great. No, I'm not going to do it. No.
He says he's sick.
Oh, you're sick?
I'm sick.
You won't even touch me.
No, it's for your sake, not mine. But nice to meet
So I'm
you.
giving up on this guy.
No, I haven't shaken. It's stupid. People go and they shake hands with people and give them colds. Listen to me. Do you want this?
I just met somebody who can't shake his hand because there's
Okay, just a second. I'm going to leave you guys. And I'm
Arthritis
going
or
to go.
something.
No, but this is okay. But I'm not. Yeah, it's good for you that I didn't shake anyone's hand.
I'll shake
Will
your
you shake my hand?
I'll give you a kiss.
Oh, I made it.
See? You made it. Okay. Just a second. So I need my files.
כן, שאת פה?
רגע, אני כבר הולכת. Okay, so I'm going to go upstairs and send you the test. This is great. It's available for you.
Perfect. If I have a little, do you have a flash drive? Yeah. If mine is in, just take it out and put it in. It's on the left-hand side.
I'm gonna go on the internet and go to my Stanford email. and
Whatever you
send
want.
it there.
Whatever you want.
I need to get on some email.
So you're from interview to interview, I understand.
Yeah.
It's back-to-back interview.
Okay. So when
How do you want me to face like that into this?
No, whatever.
Okay.
It's comfortable.
So when my grandfather was alive, I wanted to make a movie about him. And when he died in 2003, I kept pushing it off. And when before my dad got sick, I talked to my dad about this, and we decided to do it together. And then
Wonderful.
when my dad was sick, when they found the tumor, the movie turned from being about my grandfather about being about him also. And we kept pushing it off until it was too late. And then after he died, I said, okay, now I'm going to make time to do this. And since then, I've been interviewing friends and colleagues and former family and also teachers, people that I think were an influence or were an important part of his life. you knew that he was an actor. He was in a pretty famous acting studio in Israel, and I interviewed the head of that studio.
Right.
And
It's really a nice gift to your
Yeah.
younger brother, especially.
Oh,
to our children,
Because he's so young.
to everyone.
Next generation.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
and like when I talk to when I talk to people, it's just a conversation, and also the way I kind of think about it, it's not only about my dad, but it's also, I don't know, about the time and about.
Oh,
It's best I'll put it just in the
you
top.
put it where you want to do.
There.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just about like the time and I don't know, the atmosphere and I guess that's it. So we can begin at the beginning and maybe you can tell us about the first time that you met our dad, or
I don't remember the first time I met your dad.
you don't remember.
I don't remember the first time I met your dad, but I remember one of the first times he was part of this wonderful group of kids. I always call them kids, but they're not kids anymore, of course. Including this lady, Anat, and Gur Huberman, and your dad, and Rami Goldstein, who you probably don't know, and just...
This was 20 years ago? 25.
Well, I always like to think...
27 years ago. 27 years ago.
Yeah, I always like to think it was like 5 years ago, but then I keep remembering that it was a long, long time ago.
27 years.
And you talk about time, this was a magical time at Yale. It was really wonderful, particularly in our area in finance, because you had just an incredible group of really smart people and creative people and nice people, and this subgroup that came from Israel. And they all got along so wonderfully well. And they all became... Decaf cappuccino. Thank you very much. And like your dad, they all went on to become very famous professors for all the right reasons. They became famous professors, or they became very successful business people. So, you know, you look afterwards and see how well these people did. It was remarkable. They did wonderfully well. And it was, I can't tell you as a teacher what a great treat it was to have them as students. And when you say that, as I hear myself say that, it sounds like a very one-sided relationship. I'm the teacher and they're the student. But it didn't last that way. And it wasn't really that way. It was much more of a collegial relationship early on. And there was great good humor in it and great good fun.
What do you think was our dad's contribution into this relationship, into this kind of dynamic?
I thought of your dad as having, he stood out from other students. Every student in my mind stands out from the other students in some important way. And your dad stood out to me as an individual in kind of two dimensions. First, he had a great playful sense of humor. He was really funny, and he really, he just had a joy about life. He just, you know, he was, and it was a contrast with the fact that at heart, he thought deeply and seriously about things. So you had in one person someone who did both things. He always had a good sense and a good humor about himself. I never thought he took himself very seriously. And he wasn't like a class clown, that kind of good humor. It wasn't as though he was always making people laugh or something. But he always found something humorous in every situation. You know, and it was always kind of a thoughtful, reflective humor. And I love humor. It was just really, that was wonderful. And then the other thing was, he was a wise person. I mean, I don't know how much difference there was in our ages. How old was your dad when he passed away?
He was 55.
55. So I'm 8 years older than your dad. All right, 7 years older
Yeah, I
than your
heard them
dad.
talking about Guri and him a few months before he died. But maybe with you, about how the age difference then it was a great age difference, and now
Seamless.
Now it seems like nothing.
Scary things. You sort of think about how old people were when you knew them. Like when I realized that you were 38 when I knew you.
I know. I know. I mean, it really was quite remarkable how much closer we were in age than we
just
thought.
now when I was walking here, I thought I would go to see somebody who was
Some
much
old
older
guy.
than me.
Face.
I am old. But it was. But we could become friends because the age wasn't so great, even though we didn't realize that at the time. So I'd say the other thing about your dad that always struck me was that there was a wisdom to him. And there was one, I remember one, we used to have these discussions, fairly deep discussions. I'm sort of a lapsed Jew, you know. My family were high holidays Jews. So to me, they'd go to show on the special occasions, and you know, throughout the family, there were people who were deeper in their beliefs than others. But my dad was basically an atheist, and so he conveyed his religion to me. You know, so that's what I am.
Where are you from originally?
Brookline, Massachusetts,
Okay.
suburb of Boston, one of the strongly Jewish suburbs of Boston. Actually, it was mixed, but where I was the Jewish part of Boston, and I remember, so for me, I always felt that I never wanted anyone to think I wasn't Jewish, because my name is not a Jewish name, obviously. Ross, you know, it could be Jewish or not Jewish, you know. Whenever I would find myself in circumstances where there were or weren't, where there weren't other Jews, or where it might not be expected, like in business or something, I wanted people to know ahead of time that I was Jewish, because I didn't want any ill humor, or I didn't want any bad remarks, because I wanted people to know that if they said anything, I was going to respond. I wasn't going to let anything just pass. So that's the sense in which I was Jewish, that I would defend it. I think in retrospect that if Judaism had been the majority, if there were 500 million Jews in the world instead of 15 million Jews in the world, I wouldn't have felt so strongly about doing that. But when there's only a small number, you feel like, you know, it's not right to do it. And I used to talk with your dad about this thing, and about other issues like that. And he was easier to talk with about these things than other people in the group, because he had kind of a stable wisdom to him about these things, and he was very open to these kinds of discussions about things. And as I said, I learned an enormous amount, things that I remember to this day. I remember once I had come back from Germany, and when I had first gone to Germany with my wife on 1 year after we got married, on sort of a honeymoon type thing, I remember I said, I don't want to stop in Germany. So we went from Amsterdam down to Italy. We just went right through. I think I stopped for gas. I wasn't going to stop in Germany. And then, you know, German academics would ask you over and stuff. And so, okay, so I'll go and give a talk. And I got to know some of these people, and they were my generation, and they weren't the generation from before. And I came away with a positive feeling about them. They had a pride in what they got culturally out of the country, but not, you know, not excessively. And I thought they were very good, honorable people, not unlike the people I tried to surround myself with. And I remember talking to your dad about that. And he said, Steve, he said, you have to understand that if you take pride in the one, you can't forget the other. It's a package, you know. So if you're proud, if you're German and you're proud of Wagner and Mahler and Freud and Beethoven and things, you can't think that that's the only side of German culture. You have to you don't have to feel guilt, but you have to recognize about Spears and Hitler and the Kaiser before and the pogroms. So he had a very balanced view, and I thought that was wise, wiser than I had been able to bring to the situation, you know. So that was very good. That was very good for me.
And what do you think? Maybe, I guess you could call it his more academic contribution to the group.
Oh, but before I do that, I should tell. I don't know if you know this story about him coming to see me. I was his advisor.
What, the 3-minute story?
Yeah.
They're right in the book.
Oh, you read the thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that was well, my side is not much different than his, except I like to think that I was more aware of it than he thinks I was. But it was part of the playfulness I described about him. You know, he wasn't being manipulative or anything, and he wasn't being cunning. He just found a way to solve a problem that was just really a very nice human way to do it, you know? Do you agree? I think, yeah. And the fact of the matter is, he had really interesting things to say. You know, students divide into different groups when you're advising PhD students. There's some like Anat who, and Gur to some extent, who don't need advice and wouldn't take it if you gave it to them. And they just go off and they do whatever they think is right. And in their cases, for the ones we are talking about, they do brilliantly doing that. Your dad was not like that. I think because his background was weaker when he came in economics, and maybe not in mathematics, but in finance and things like that. He was less sure of himself in that. And so he wanted a little more guidance as to what would be interesting, what would not, and what to work on and what not to work on. And in my experience, the ones who need that guidance are indistinguishable later in terms of creativity and contributions from the ones who don't. It just takes them a little longer to get there, okay? Or they want a little more structure. But it was very early that you could see his creativity. That was what was really nice. So I did what, there's this one class of theory in finance called the capital asset pricing model, which is this mean variance model. So all it's about, you take means and you take variances and you work with the analytics of this. And the nice thing about it is that it's an endless,
Pictures.
Yeah, pictures, nice pictures. And the nice thing about it is you do endless amounts of, and nice geometry and things. And there's endless numbers of exercises surrounding this. So you can ask questions like,
email.
Okay, go ahead. Do you have my key?
2231.
Yeah, okay, I give it to you, okay. So you can ask these wonderful questions about, suppose there's 3 assets in the world and I add a 4th. Suppose there's 8 and I take 2 away. Suppose there's 2 people and one of them lives in France and one lives in Israel, and one looks at one model and one says, how would it work? There's just 100 exercises you can ask about it. And so I could always pick some of those that no one knew the answer to and give them to a student if they said, well, what should I work on? So, Shmuel, why don't you look at this? What would happen if you took one asset away and you didn't see one asset in the capital asset pricing model? And this actually had some philosophical background to it, because it came down to deep questions of whether this theory could ultimately be tested without looking at every single thing that moved in the world, which we can't do. So if you're missing one thing, could you still test it, And I never knew if this would have an interesting answer rather. Questions are interesting in our field in large part if they have interesting answers. Not just the question, You don't even necessarily want to know the answer. Is the answer interesting, And it was really not a long time before your dad showed that it was very interesting answers. Really interesting answers. And he could sense what was important and not important about it. That was also a sign of being very strong. He could show, for example, that if you were missing one thing, that even if it was a little thing you were missing, it could have a huge effect. It could really make the whole thing impossible to test, even if you were missing one brick out of one building somewhere. The theory was that precarious and that sensitive, That was a very important contribution. So that was just one of the things, and that was great. I mean, you see someone do that, okay, now it's like watching a bird that learns how to fly, Okay, leave the nest, you can go fly.
This began in those years, in the Yale years, and then it proceeded on.
It went on, and then he did things, he went in a different direction. He became both a theorist and an empiricist. So he did a lot of work with the actual statistics and the data, which was nice because he had a very practical sense to him. So if you have a practical sense to you, not only do you want to see what reasoning and theory gives you, you also want to see if it's true. You want to take it to the data and see, do the numbers and the data bear out, what I think is happening? And the answer is yeah. And over the years, we didn't see each other as much as I suspect either of us would have liked. It was just we're busy and all, but we stayed in contact, and I always viewed your dad as a friend. I remember I don't know if you know, you asked if I'd been to Israel, and the first time I went to Israel, the first person who picked me up was your dad.
Yeah?
He picked me up at the airport, and he said, oh, it was exactly when Israel invaded Lebanon in the north. And I remember,
really?
yeah, I remember that, because your dad picked me up, and he said we were going to Jerusalem, and I'd never been to Israel. And so we come out of the airport, and we stop in a little town for lunch, and there was an Arab wedding in the street. And I thought they'd put it on just for me. What a great ceremony. And there was music and procession and all. I remember we had coffee and good falafel and stuff. And then later that day, we drove into Jerusalem up through the pine forests. And when you see Jerusalem, and I remember we arrived just as the sun was setting, and the sun, the city walls glow gold in the sun, you know. And you're from outside, and it's hard to see why the history and all this means people fight so hard about this little place. And what's the fight about, you know? And why should you fight? It's just a little city, you know. But when you come up and you see the striking, startling beauty of it, you know, it's just amazing. And you see it was moving for your dad too, you know. And I think it was the next day he was supposed to pick me up, or 2 days later he was supposed to pick me up, and he was going to show me around, and Anat showed up. And I said, where's Shmuel? She said, he's with his ambulance unit up north. They got called up. So that was the first time.
He almost didn't make it back to Yale for the next semester then.
Yeah, that was the first time I came to Israel. So
I want to ask a bit about what exactly does an advisor do with a graduate student? What's
The
relationship. People have different things, so I can tell you how I look at it. I can't tell you how other people look at it. I'm a funny person in that way. I'm sort of a touchy-feely person about it, as opposed to a mathematical, analytic person. So I mean, that's what I do is analytics and math, but that's not quite how I think of the advisor relationship. I like being an advisor. I like being a mentor, and in part it's because I don't think I had one good example of it when I was in college, and I never had another example of it in graduate school. And let me break that up. I had one great example in graduate school, but I had a lot of bad examples. So I sort of learned from the bad examples. I'm not going to treat people like this, you know. And some people think there's a routine. You have to. A friend of mine once said this. He said, being an advisor means the following. He said, first thing you have to do is you have to tell the student what to write about. Then you have to write it for them. And then when you're all done, you have to convince them they did it. Convince them that they did it. Well, I never took that. That was never how I thought about the thing. I always thought about it very differently. I thought you had to convey your enthusiasm for it. If you were enthusiastic about it, you wanted them to do it. Because it's hard work being in research. And it's hard for a funny reason. You spend a lot of time at it, it's a lot of effort, and you don't get immediate reward. In business, you know, you do a good job, they pay you more money, or you make more money or something. But in research, it's sort of long-term, uncertain feedback. So you should be enthusiastic about it. You should want to know these things, and it's sort of fun to do this. And I always felt that way, and I thought it was good to communicate that to them. You should give people a real sense that there's a lot of stuff to be done. It's hard when you finish, you know, you're taking these courses from me. My job when I teach these courses to you is to tell you everything about this stuff. And so you start to think that I know everything about this stuff. So you think of me as having, or the teacher as having this enormous body of knowledge that you can't begin to get into. And I think of it as being like the shell of an egg, you know, you're just a fraction, just all you have to burst through and you'll see all the things that I don't know. You know, so you think I know a lot, and I think I don't know anything. So I want to give that sense to people that there's a lot of stuff that they have to come to know that it just isn't known. And so it's really a wonderful area to do research. And so that kind of enthusiasm and that kind of sense of adventure is what I want people to get from me. I can give you some practical help. So you're working on a problem, I can say, well, you know, I've tried that and it doesn't work. Or maybe you ought to look in this direction or that direction. My job is not to meet with you every 3 days for 2 hours. I'm not sure that's healthy. I mean, you're not to become my derivative. You're not to become some shadow of me, or, in fact, very seldom, occasionally I did, but very seldom did I ever write a paper with a student. I thought that was always sort of a mistake, you know, because they should write their own stuff. I shouldn't be writing it with you.
Many advisors write their papers with their...
Many advisors write papers with their students. I think that's a good way to teach. It's not dishonorable. They just think it's a good way to teach, to get them to start the process. But I don't think so. I want you to do it yourself. And I want you to come to me and be completely open about even the craziest half-baked things you want. I never tell people that what they're doing is not interesting. That's horrible. The hardest thing the most important thing for research is to develop your own sense of taste. What is important and what's interesting to work on, and what's not interesting, what's not important, you know. Your sense of taste, not my sense of taste, your sense of taste, you know. And it's hard, particularly if you come into this field without having an undergraduate background. If you come in as a mathematician or physicist, you have to develop a sense of what you think is important.
People come from physics into
Commonly. Physics and math, commonly. My introductory PhD course now, I've got half the kids in it have PhDs in the sciences.
Oh, really? Yeah. PhDs?
PhDs in mathematics or physics, or they're postdocs, or they're you know, in PhD programs in these areas. But a lot of people, very few people come in who don't have a strong undergraduate mathematics or science background, at least.
25 years ago, from people I talked to, was kind of I don't know what to call it, a turning point, or kind of an era of change for, I don't know, economics.
Where mathematics became more and more important, you mean, or?
From what I understand, kind of about the time that my dad came to Chicago, actually, that it was a very influential time. Milton Friedman.
Absolutely.
He didn't even. This is a little biographical. He didn't even think of studying finance. I think my father, right?
Right.
He arrived and
at Yale
just pulled him over.
Come to this stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because at that time, people were realizing that the mathematics and the science of finance was wonderful.
What was before? What was happening before?
Well, it matured. There was a great discovery called the Black-Scholes model. Mm-hmm. And there were several other discoveries, the capital asset pricing model, things like that. And suddenly you had this body of literature and this technical apparatus that enabled you to actually make real understanding and efficient markets, real understanding of what was going on in financial markets and asset markets, and to approach it, pardon me, as you would a scientist. You know, you had theories and you had data and you could check how the two related to each other. It was a time of great discovery and great innovation in the field. And so if you came out with the tools that enabled you to understand this material, it was just a spectacular time to be in it. It was a great time to be, you know, it's like I tell people it's like surfing, you know, you caught the wave. You were right there at the right time to catch the wave, you know. And that's, I think, what happened to Anat and Gur and your dad, and it was a great time for them, you know. They saw this. And then when they went to Chicago, Chicago was perhaps the most exciting place in economics in the world, and finance, you know. I mean, Chicago, MIT maybe. They were just
Do you remember
brilliant people.
How my dad got there?
Well,
what was the process?
Yes, these extraordinarily competitive process of what happens is we have the meat market. And schools go and they interview people and see which one they want to hire as an assistant professor. And as you might imagine, becoming an assistant professor at Chicago is immensely prestigious and very competitive. And so he came out of Yale. I said, this is a good guy. I'm sure other people said, this is a good guy. And they interviewed him and said, yes, this is a really good guy. It's as simple as that, you know. It's a personal thing. It helped that your dad had a good personality. It helped that he had that. it helps anyone. I remember once a comment that a friend of mine, one of my other students said, he said, he was Chinese, and he had a very tough time getting a job. And he said, if I had a cute French accent instead of a Chinese accent, everyone would be hiring me. I said, Ray Chang was it. I said, Ray, that's right, He, like your dad, passed away. He was one of my students who passed away many years ago, actually. But
I asked you a little bit about that because I guess you know this, but I guess 5 years before, no, not 5, 6 or 7 years before my dad came to Yale, he lived on kibbutz.
right.
And he was a socialist, and then he went to be an actor, and then he went to college. And from the stories, I'm trying to understand at what point did his opinions change?
It didn't necessarily change that much.
Change.
Didn't change that much. One of the things we had in common was that I was raised as a socialist and a Marxist.
Really?
I was raised as a Marxist, a socialist, and an atheist before I became a capitalist.
Biography of every great economist.
Well, we're all like that. But my family, as I said, my dad was an atheist, although he wouldn't really say it. But I tell people, can you imagine growing up and going to a friend's family, and I was like 11 years old, and did you do it?
No, I didn't. Called them.
What did they say?
Oh, they're working on it. 5-star hotel and 3-star service. What did you say? The internet.
Let me say this and then go check on this.
Wireless?
Well, no,
So-
they said they'll work fixing it.
Wireless? The what?
Wireless, but you have to have some password. But
That
I
wasn't
told
it.
them, and
It
they
just
said
had limited
they
and no
said that they have a problem with the internet.
Yeah, right.
David Intercom came and told me.
Yes. That's what I'm telling
This is
you.
one of the only places you really need wireless internet.
Exactly.
Crazy.
So we want to send the damn stupid little file, and we can't do it. It's so annoying.
And so,
I did it for a few minutes.
יש לך את זה במחשב? יש לך את זה או שאתה פה?
גם במחשב שלי.
לא, אבל יש את זה במייל? אם יש את זה במייל, אני יכול
yeah, can I go for a minute and just tell?
No. You
Okay.
have to ask them down here. Because
I will.
we're
That's what I'm going to do.
Right. And
I'll
if you don't finish the
continue.
interview, don't
Okay, let me continue. Okay. So I was 11 years old, and I went to the house of my best friend, and I'm talking to his mother, who's a very interesting woman. His dad was a labor organizer, and talking to his mother. And she said, Steve, what do you believe in? And she said, well, we're all Jewish. She said, what do you believe in? She said, and I was quite proud of myself. I'm an agnostic. I can't, there's no logical reason to believe that there is or isn't a God. And she said, no, you're just a coward, If you really, you just won't admit that there isn't a God because you're afraid to say that there isn't a God, And she was right. So I said, okay, I don't think there is a God. And I think your dad had kind of a similar background. He was a socialist by, upbringing, I guess, and I don't know about his early history.
Was an atheist, though.
Yeah, so
He hated religion. He wasn't
Yeah.
an atheist.
Yeah,
he
he was,
hated religion.
I hated religion. I hate to this
just
day.
saw we just walked outside for a second. Saw this group of religious girls with black.
I don't hate religion. I just hate what religions do to people. It's just awful.
Especially here in our area.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got some terrible problems here, But, so I think, and so the question is, why did you become an economist? For me, I actually remember an epiphany, and I don't know if it was similar for your dad. You believe all this Marxism stuff. There is, I was a mathematician or mathematically inclined, so, there's a sort of pseudo-math that surrounds Marxist, the transformation problem and this sort of things like that. And I like game theory and stuff, and and then I remember taking my first economics course at Harvard, and they had price theory, and they had Pareto efficiency, and it's this sort of toy theorem that shows that if a market hasn't got any frictions, and if people just trade willingly, and that what happens is the outcome is as good as it could possibly be. Yeah, I mean, you could give more to somebody and less to someone else, but there's no way to make everybody better off. You can switch it around. I can make you richer and you poorer, but I can't make you both better off. The system is as efficient as it could be. And all of a sudden that changed. I said, it's a beautiful, I said, these guys have theorems. I said, it works, And I think to some extent your dad must have had the same kind of experience that I'm just projecting. You see the beauty in some of the analysis, and it really is beautiful. You see the power in the analysis, and you realize that believing in these things has nothing to do with whether you're a good person or you believe in sort of an appropriate social distribution of the resources. It comes down to technical questions. Is it really better in a society? Will people be better off if the government owns everything as opposed to if individuals own everything? Not at all clear. In fact, it's pretty clear increasingly that that's not the case. And I think you get wrapped up in the science of the question and learn to separate that from the ethics and philosophy of what's good and what's bad, because they are separable issues. We can agree between us that it's good that the income distribution be flatter, or it's good that the poor people be helped. We can agree on all those things, but we can disagree about whether it should be a capitalist system or a socialist system, And I think your dad was a scientist at the end, and so you really said these are scientific questions, and they can inform ethical debate,
Okay, we won't go into that.
Okay.
But I also wanted to ask a bit about Yale at the time. My dad has another friend named Minnie, who was learning law at Yale at the time, and he kind of described it as I guess.
I was there.
Yeah, but he was. But
he's a professor.
The fact that he's from another field is that he described it as I guess discovering the world, kind of for him.
Intellectually.
Yeah,
and
intellectually.
It's a very, very exciting place.
Yeah.
No question about that.
And I wanted to maybe hear a bit about that, about Yale 1980 or 81 was.
Yale is a really, pardon me. Universities are very, very big places, and so you only get to understand that quadrant that you're involved with. So the law school was a place I had lots of friends, and I knew a lot about the law school, and I knew a lot about the economics department and math and the management school and things like that. It was an extraordinarily exciting place. We had truly brilliant people in the faculty and truly brilliant people in the students that you see after the fact how brilliant they were. I mean, this was an extraordinary place, very exciting, where much cutting-edge work was going on at the time. The law school is clearly the most academic and most respected of law schools in the world. And it was one of the very first law schools to move into economics areas and ask economics kind of questions in the law. So there was a community of social scientists, is the way to say it, people who really were interested in thinking deeply and analytically about the world that they were living in. So that made it very exciting, and you could be there in finance or economics and have a friend in the law school, and you actually had a common sense of communication. There were things you could commonly talk about, and it wasn't like I'm telling you about how class action suits work, and I'm telling you about how the capital asset pricing model works, and okay, it wasn't like that. You saw that there was economics in the question of the class action lawsuit, and you saw that there were interesting questions in the law that had economic foundations, so that dialogue was really quite wonderful.
And the students took part in this dialogue?
Very much amongst themselves. You can speak more for me. And at the same time, in finance, it was a very special time because economics was Yale economics at the time was one of the great economics departments of the world, rivaling the Yales and the Harvards and the Harvards, MITs, and Chicago. So it was a great place in economics. I don't know, 4th or 5th best economics department in the world, so with some singularly important figures who, my recollection was, didn't really like finance very much. So it was because, you had to actually fight for finance. You had to say, this is good stuff. Yeah, it's a legitimate area of intellectual inquiry. You should be thinking about this and looking at it. And they hadn't really tooled up or understood it. So
approved them by students, right?
So it was great to get, you got the, if the best students in their department and everywhere else in the university were taking finance, that was a real lesson to the people in operations research on the one hand and economics.
Because in all the other fields, he was
Right.
screen skimming. He was
I was,
everybody.
I got the best. I got the
He
best.
was
I got
just
the best.
like a fisherman.
Yes, it was wonderful. I got the very, very best.
I remember when Mark Grunblatt was working either with you or with Herb Scarf, and then somehow Herb lost him and you won.
Yeah, right. No, it was wonderful. It was really wonderful to get the quality of
What
people.
was it just Steve's personality that?
No, it was the electricity of the subject.
The electricity. Of the
Well, that he
But-
brought out.
Yeah, but how did it come? How did it come into play? I mean, people were just, you know, there's Steve Ross. He has
No,
a
so
great
it was-
class.
it
You have to
was-
come take his class. You have to see it.
It was sort of, it started like that. So people were, taking the class, and taking the class was like becoming, a fan, and then he took the steps. He was welcoming. Not all professors are welcoming of students. It's, they have to do their own research. Some people think it's a chore to advise PhD students. It's work. It's sort of thankless work considered by some people. And this guy seemed to want to do it and welcome it and sort of invite us to work with him. After the course, he said, "Come on, I can give you research." Money.
Topics and money.
And money was involved too. And,
Okay,
and
now we get it.
It's finance. What do you expect?
yeah.
Finance
No,
or
but it's like, I'll support your research, and here's a problem to work on, but if you don't like this problem, you can work on something else. And so he gave me a problem. I spent a bunch of time on it and didn't want to work on it anymore.
You worked on whatever you wanted to work on, right?
And I found what I
Right,
wanted to work
right.
on. But,
It was fine.
and it wasn't even exactly what he was working on, but
No, but I think, well, I don't know if I told you, when I first came to Yale, there was great reluctance to have any finance at all. And the only reason that they wanted me was because they had a demand on the part of the business school for the MBA students to teach finance. And they had one guy who was there already, and so there were now two of us in finance. And by contrast, most business schools have like 20 people in finance.
well, it was a small
At that
business
time.
school. It was a no.
At the time, it was a small business
It
school,
was a very small business.
but it wasn't that small. But yes, he had these two guys, and this other guy was a Harvard kind of guy who didn't do any research. He just sort of, huh?
Who, Ibbotson?
Whippern.
Oh, Whipper, I remember.
So,
And he had an office next to you. That's right.
yeah.
It's a Harvard kind of guy. Yes.
Oh, he
Well,
was
Harvard
just
Business School
teaching
kind of guy at the
cases,
time.
they
I mean,
don't-
Harvard has changed, but at the time,
No.
no.
It's just
Anecdotes.
Anecdotes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Elaborately
Case studies.
structured, like case studies in the law, elaborately structured.
But they don't do any. They don't
Let's not
spend
go
time
into this
thinking about their
rivalry.
ideas.
No, it's not a rivalry. It's a change that occurred in the profession over time.
It's a style
Okay.
of teaching very unique to Harvard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Teach
And
everything by anecdotes.
right. And so the question is how do you so I know the math guys and the econ guys, everyone's kind of suspicious of this finance stuff. But we actually had brilliant things that had been done in finance. So they asked if I gave a series of 3 lectures. I don't know if you know, this might have been before you. I gave a series of 3 lectures. And you had this beautiful stuff to talk about. So I had these skeptical OR and mathematicians and economists there. And I remember once my wife is a classicist, and she said, let's go, when we were dating, she said, T.R. Broughton is giving a talk about what you can infer from gravestones in Roman cemeteries. I said, all right, this should be okay. So I went to this thing, and I said, he's talking about, well, you can see this Heracles died in 170 BC, and then so, and you can see from the stone there's this, and I said, this is pretty easy. About 20 minutes in, I was lost. Yeah, Heracles had 2 kids, and there was another kid over here. There was a niece and a nephew, and she's following it. I didn't have a clue what was going on, And I said, well, there's really something here, So that was a good lesson, because when I gave these seminars at Yale, you could tell they knew that there was something exciting here, and they were lost. You tried to keep them along, but couple of 20 minutes in, you could tell they thought that they could easily get all this stuff, and they realized they can't. and there's something important here. And what you want to do is show them that there's something that a university can't be great without having. And I believe that's how universities should function. That you don't get resources just because you have a name on your door that you're the department of X or Y or Z. You fight for what you get, and you convince people that there's value in what you have, you know. And so that was the period of time. So we were just coming out of that, and there was this growing recognition amongst the economists and the mathematicians that this is really great stuff, and we ought to have some of this. And so I think you students captured some of that excitement at the time from the field.
There was a I don't know if it's a study or an article not long ago that rated the top economists in Israel, and yeah,
No, it rated the top academic publishers
but
by citations.
But in economics,
Economics?
it was called in economics, and our dad was one of
Oh, sure.
one of the top
Sure.
10 whatever.
Sure.
And so I asked another friend during the interview, what's the difference between is someone that does finance, is he an economist? And he said that there's a, he said that I don't know if it's a debate, I don't remember exactly. He said that I guess not all economists would want to call people in finance economists, but I guess that today it's much more accepted that finance people are economists.
It uses the paradigm.
When I first went into this, I was an undergrad. I was a assistant professor in economics at the Wharton School, and before I went to Yale, and I really didn't want to be. I didn't like what I was doing. I was doing international trade and things like that. So I wandered around and went to different seminars, and I remember telling one of the professors in the economics department I'd gone to the finance workshop, and it was spectacular because I told you who I'd seen. It was wonderful. I said, this is wonderful. I think this is what I want to do. And he said to me, Steve, he said, finance is to economics as osteopathy is to medicine. And so I got a chance when
Before that, there wasn't a respectable
No.
until the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah,
It was the first time
it wasn't
that
respectable.
sort of, serious academic work that economists could sort of recognize
Recognize is important.
as important or
Yeah.
as well done, or
Yeah.
based on, you know.
Yeah.
sound.
Well, I said
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess Modigliani and Miller was one of the first.
they were, but they were sufficiently economic. They were sufficiently economic so that they weren't. It didn't threaten as finance, you know. And then you had Bill Sharp and
Right.
Mossine, but they were sort of OR guys, so that wasn't really another field as economics either. So the economists always had an excuse until you had Black-Scholes. Then there was no. Recognize is important.
As important or
Yeah.
as well done, or
Yeah.
based on, you know.
Yeah.
sound.
Well, I said
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess Modigliani and Miller was one of the first.
they were, but they were sufficiently economic. They were sufficiently economic so that they weren't. It didn't threaten as finance, you know. And then you had Bill Sharp and
Right.
Mossine, but they were sort of OR guys, so that wasn't really another field as economics either. So the economists always had an excuse until you had Black-Scholes. Then there was no more excuse. But when some friends got the Nobel Prize in economics, they asked if I would give a talk for them at the American Economic Association. So I gave this talk, and I told this story, you know, about osteopathy and things. And then I said, and you know, counting now, they've given the Nobel Prize in economics to 7 osteopaths. Yeah. That was pretty, you know. So it's changed.
And we
Clearly
have,
changed.
have hope for more.
I think maybe now.
You next?
No, not today. We're gonna.
No, next on the Nobel.
Oh, no. I'm talking about him.
It'll be nice. We'll
Maybe
see.
to move on, to ask maybe a bit about. You said that you didn't. That both of you would have wanted to keep in touch more. But
Yes.
What was I guess the contact that you had with each other?
What kind of relationship do you?
Very sporadic. You know, hardly enough. We would see each other at meetings and spend some time talking, you know. Occasionally there would be emails about something, You know,
You didn't do any.
we traveled around. There'd be a student who he had that he was recommending, and he'd write me a letter about the student, things like that. And the intellectual content was, there were a couple of flurries of things, because he did some work with Mark Grindblatt, which was really kind of interesting. Yeah. The stuff on factors and things.
With Mark?
I thought it was with
Yeah, I
Mark.
think I saw one.
With Mark Grindblatt, the paper?
I think I saw one type.
I thought it was.
Very well, I missed that.
I think there was a paper with Mark, but I could be wrong. But I remember Mark and Shmuel and I talking about factors and things like that, things that I was interested in financial markets and stuff. And I remember that discussing those issues with him. It was always, as I said, he had turned his attention increasingly towards statistical and econometric type analysis and stuff. That was dear to interests of mine, but somewhat removed from the direction that I was going on in my research. So our research directions are parting a little bit, you know. And in part, it's interesting to think of that, because the field was growing so rapidly. 10 years earlier, because the field was so small, those two strands would have been very much closer. But 10 years later, when we were doing it, there were so many more people populating the field that the differences in things were becoming magnified. You know, if you have, if you got 10 people working on something in a broad heading, they all know everybody. If you have hundreds of people working on it, you know, they start to get interested in, well, what about that detail or that detail? It becomes more narrow.
But does anything stand out as, I guess, a meaningful accomplishment of my dad that you can put your finger on and say?
How did he stand out in his field, in his direction?
Oh, I think he's one of the leaders in his direction. I would think of him as, pardon me, I think of him as, I've got to sort of describe this a little bit more closely. You have sort of a spectrum of things. You have pure theoretical work. You have pure empirical work. So pure theory is, you know, just formalism and models, assumptions, conclusions, philosophical kinds of things. Pure empirical work is, well, we took this data and we looked for this and we found it and we did some more of it and we checked that and we did all this. So that's what, and then in between, there's a collection of work on what might be called theoretical econometrics. These are folks who concern themselves with how to interpret the empirical things and what the theoretical models are that underlie the empirical testing, and what is the empirical testing saying about the theoretical models and things. So that interface is really kind of a critical area, and that's where I think your dad stood out. That was the area that he stood out in. I thought of him as one of the deepest thinkers in that area. You know, and I still, you know, his work is still very important. Will always be very important in that area. One of the advantages of doing it early is that you always be important. Because people will build on what the things the early stuff is still the most important stuff.
No.
He was also a craftsman, and I take that very seriously.
Makes sense.
There's people who do things, and they're immensely creative, and you learn a lot from reading them, and maybe they rush to it or something like that, or they lack the tools to do it, but in the end, it's almost like you have to fill in the colors yourself. You know, it's not as though they do all the creative work. It's just that sometimes it's so poorly done that they want to take credit for creativity, and actually the people who come afterwards, who were really looking at the same kind of thing and did some of the same things, they do so much that it's not clear what the first person really did. See, and your dad was not like that. Your dad, when you read something from your dad, there weren't mistakes. They weren't missing things. It was solidly done.
Attention to details.
Attention to detail, but not to the exclusion of things of interest. I mean, it was well done. And I like the word craftsmanlike. It was craftsmanlike work. You know, that's important to me.
Although they found in the Googles and my father's paper, they found a mistake. Is that
Yeah, I heard something.
an empirical mistake?
Yeah, mistake on my thesis paper.
I remember somehow that comes to mind. But mistakes don't mean it's not crafty.
I know. Just
People do mistakes.
asking,
Okay.
you want to have mistakes if you don't, if you do
Positive
it.
spin on everything.
No, if nothing you ever do is a mistake, then you never really pushed yourself very far.
It's a positive spin.
Yeah.
It's a lesson for today.
No, I mean, what a dull world it would be if it was all perfect. But that doesn't mean, I mean, nothing was sloppy. Everything was well thought out. Professional, craftsman-like.
What I want to ask about you coming to this conference. What does it mean for you to come?
Well, it's a way of honoring your dad, okay, and it's like a good Irish wake, like sitting shiva. It's a way of kind of in the friendliness and the amusement and the pleasure you get in the company of all these people, which you always look forward to. It's, in my mind, the best way to remember and honor those who've passed. Because you can't walk around with a long face all the time about this. It's not how your dad was, and he wouldn't have wanted other people to be that way. So, there's going to be good people at this conference. It's going to be fun to talk with them, and we'll recollect things about your dad, and that'll reinforce things that we each know about him. And we'll talk about other things, and we'll just, So for me, there wasn't a question of coming. It just wouldn't be a question of coming. It was easy to come.
Okay.
One more question.
Go for it.
How did you hear about his passing
Illness?
away, and maybe his illness before? Yeah.
Did you tell me? Anat told me, I think. I couldn't believe it when I heard about it. The story I heard was that someone observed him dragging his leg, and he had not taken notice of it or something, and then he went to the doctor and discovered he had the brain tumor, and then in a couple of months he was gone. It was amazing to me that the fragility of our lives is just really it was just a kind of another lesson. I mean, at my age, I don't have parents anymore. And I've had good friends and relatives who've passed away. But I'll tell you something: when your students pass away, it's a little bit like your children passing away. It's a sense of mortality, and it's not some macabre things. I'm really old, I'm going to die. You don't think that way. You just assume that as part of the firmament that they'll always be there, that all these people will be there, and there's a little hole there because your dad has passed away. For you guys, there's a big hole. But for those of us who knew him, depending on how well you knew him, there's a meaningful loss. So you think that way about it. And when Anat told me, I just can't. I mean, it's so random and shocking. It's just. And I will tell you, in my cynical way, I said, boy, in this world, if you had to pick and choose, I know a lot of shits I'd rather see go before him. There's a lot, yeah. He could have picked a lot of other people ahead of the queue. I'm sure you guys feel that way. I certainly feel that way.
Well, I guess we're happy to meet you.
Oh, I'm great to meet you guys, I heard about you over many, many years, I thought you'd be about that high. You were once, yeah. How old are the two of you?
I just turned 28 and he just turned 25.
Yeah.
25 and 28, okay. And you have a younger brother who's...
With the Yale years.
16.
How's he doing?
He's a teenager. He's still a teenager. Even though the past year he's okay.
Yeah. There was, Israeli academics, and your dad was one of them, have this feature. I remember talking to your dad. He worked so hard.
Yeah.
because he was both over here and back at Wharton.
And over here, he was also
Yes.
all kinds of
He
stuff
said
on
to
the side.
me, I remember we talked about that for a while once, about how he just, guys, he said, boy, I teach all the time, you know? And so I think he felt that his research was suffering because he was teaching too much, you know, but he didn't really feel he had a choice in
Teaching too
it.
much. He was also working on the side a lot. Before
Yeah.
that, he was dean, so that also
Yeah.
took away from his research.
Yeah, yeah.
He was working like 3 times as much as a regular person.
Yeah, I know. He was working really, really hard, you know.
That's a lesson we can all learn from.
Well, but you know, I think in the end, while he would have liked to have redirected his activities, I don't think your dad would have worked any less hard.
Yeah, but maybe more things that
He loved to do.
So
That's
that
right.
changes a lot.
That's right. That's right. And it's not as though he didn't like what he was doing. He just thought he was doing too much of one part of it, too much of one thing. And I think that's right.
Okay, so I think we all need to.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you very
Well, I'm going to go like this and put a sport jacket on. Is that a problem, do you think?
No.
Okay, good.
I wish we
My
could
mother
do the
has a
same.
strict dress code.
Oh, she does? I hope. Will she be offended if I go like this?
No, I think you.
Okay.
Here, I'll do it.
Yeah, can you do it?
So,
It was great meeting you guys.
yeah.
You too. Thank you very much.
We won't shake hands.
I'm doing you a favor. What do you tell you?
Our grandfather would do the same. He
What do you
never, every time we come to him in the winter,
He never shakes hands.
he'd never shake hands.
I went to this party. It's a medical fact. That's how you
It
get
is.
these things. So why should you do it? For some stupid ritual.
Yeah. People don't listen.
All right, guys.
Okay.
Thank you
Feel
very much.
feel good.
Yeah. Okay. Just gotta get more stuff in me.
Yeah.
More aspirin.